People used to say that the art of diplomacy is helping people have your way. But diplomacy is, I mean, that's a cute saying, but diplomacy is much more than that, of course. Diplomacy normally is a series of successful negotiations, starting with the easiest, starting with those that you know you can accomplish. The best way to be successful in diplomacy is to start, crawl before you walk and walk before you run. And that's what a successful diplomat learns, I think.
The character of diplomacy is listening, trying to understand the other part, and then trying to get a joint solution of things. And that we respect each other as human beings, even if we have different backgrounds and ID. And I think we need much more about that in our world, because we just have one world, and we need to take care of the world and live here with our kids and grandkids and so on.
Diplomacy is useless unless there is some kind of you have to have some kind of opening for trust. You have to feel trust, otherwise you cannot have a relationship. And I feel it's the same with art. A very important part of diplomacy is art. We communicate through that. When we see something visualized, when we see something, an idea embodied in a piece of art, for example, in a painting or sculpture, it reflects, at best, our own personal ambitions.
La diplomacia es esencial. Puede hacer la diferencia entre guerra y paz, entre pobreza y prosperidad, entre opresión y libertad. Frases como esta reciben al visitante en el Museo Nacional de la Diplomacia Norteamericana de la ciudad de Washington D.C., un proyecto conjunto entre el Departamento de Estado y la Fundación Centro de la Diplomacia. Este recinto tiene como misión contar la historia de la diplomacia y sus protagonistas, invitar al visitante a descubrir qué es la diplomacia y su impacto en la vida cotidiana.
Here in North America, we have over 1,000 museums that commemorate battles or commemorate wars, military museums. Until recently, we've never had a museum that commemorates the important role that diplomacy plays in our foreign and security policy, and now we have that.
En este museo se llevó a cabo la develación de una escultura creada por el artista sueco Johan Falkman, el Busto de James Baker III, quien ha pasado a la historia como uno de los diplomáticos más influyentes en la escena política de los Estados Unidos. La idea surgió durante una reunión en la ciudad de Malmö, en Suecia, convocada por los filántropos Dan y Christine Olofsson.
When James Baker was in Malmö, and Johan Falkman proposed the bust, and James Baker liked the idea. And then Johan made an excellent bust. And then I think then it became a discussion where James Baker wanted to have it. And it came actually on the best place, the National Museum of American Diplomacy. And at the instance there, on the new part they're going to build, they're going to have the best of their most distinguished and skilled diplomat, and that's James Baker III, in my view.
Well, I feel very honored that there will now be a bust of me in the lobby of the State Department. I feel privileged to have been cast in bronze by an excellent sculptor. And we had the unveiling of the bust, and it's beautiful, and the location in the Department of State is quite lovely. You know, I work for a wonderful president named George H.W. Bush. I worked for other wonderful presidents too, but George H.W. Bush and I were very close. We'd been friends for 60 years. I ran all of his campaigns. He was the godfather to my daughter. And whenever we would achieve something, be successful in something, he would call me on the phone or say to me, hey, Bake, who'd have thunk it? Which means who would have thought it? And we used to say that to each other a lot anytime we had a success. And now, of course, it's a great privilege for me to see some of those successes displayed through the mechanism, through the medium of a bust of me in the State Department. It's a way to preserve memory and to preserve legacy.
El artista sueco Johan Falkman, pintor y escultor, maestro del retrato, heredero del expresionismo europeo y apasionado del muralismo mexicano, ha recorrido diversos países con su obra, entre estos Cuba, Sudáfrica, México o los Estados Unidos, donde se graduó del Instituto Pratt de Arte y Diseño en Nueva York. Falkman concibió la escultura de James Baker más allá de la simple reproducción de un rostro.
A portrait must in one way or in several ways correspond to people's ideas of that person. It must be an artist's interpretation, but it cannot be completely subjective. It's very important that when you make a portrait of a public figure like Secretary Baker, the sculpture must somewhere correspond to people's inner picture of this individual. Otherwise, it's not successful. You know, you can't defend it as a portrait.
The monumentality of Washington, America at its absolute, how can you say, best or sharpest. All of those elements are included in the portrait of James Baker, and he has that in his personality. And I love that. So for me, making a portrait of him, a person with all those elements included in his personality, everything that he represents is that, made it easy for me because I love that. So from that point of view, it wasn't a challenge. It was a very, very wonderful and, how can I say, smooth experience to work on the portrait because of those elements being included in his personality.
Los filántropos Dan y Christine Olofsson concibieron el proyecto Star for Life, un programa sin fines de lucro que promueve la educación y prevención del SIDA en niños y jóvenes y que comenzó en Sudáfrica. Entre otras iniciativas, fueron ellos quienes auspiciaron la creación de esta obra de arte que se erige como un símbolo del valor de la diplomacia en la tarea de promover las buenas relaciones entre países.
Well, there is a parallel. I mean, diplomacy is a way of solving problems between countries. And philanthropy is a way of solving social problems. Without the war, there is riots and poverty and so on. So they both have a good contribution. Let's say the good philanthropy is working on the ground, direct to the people. But the good diplomacy work with solving there's big problems between nations and peace in the world. So it's different perspective.
La ceremonia de develación del busto de James Baker III en el Museo Nacional de la Diplomacia Norteamericana fue presidida por Anthony Blinken, secretario de Estado del gobierno demócrata de Joseph Biden. Así se refirió a su colega, el republicano James Baker.
There was no job that he loved more than being Secretary of State. And he showed exceptional leadership in guiding the foreign policy of our country with a lasting impact on this country and on the world.
James Baker III ocupó puestos de gran relevancia en el gobierno estadounidense durante 3 periodos presidenciales: Gerald Ford, Ronald Reagan y George Bush, con quien fungió como secretario de Estado de enero de 1989 a agosto de 1992. Durante su mandato en el Departamento de Estado, Viajó a 90 países extranjeros cuando Estados Unidos enfrentaba los desafíos de la posguerra fría.
James Baker served as Secretary of State for 43 months. I think it's safe to say that there are a few times in history when the world has changed so profoundly, what you call, Jim, a whirlwind of history. During that period, the Soviet Union disintegrated without conflict. The Berlin Wall fell. The US and the USSR undertook the most significant reduction ever in nuclear arms. Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait was swiftly routed. The Madrid Conference made visible for the first time a horizon of Middle East peace.
Well, I think perhaps the most significant moment was when we were trying to reverse Saddam Hussein's aggression against Kuwait. And I talked to the Soviet foreign minister. Remember now that this was during the Cold War. I talked to the Soviet foreign minister who also disapproved of this unprovoked aggression by a large country against a small country. And I said, we need to somehow find a way to mutually condemn this. Now, Iraq was a client state of the Soviet Union, but Shevardnadze, Eduard Shevardnadze, the Soviet foreign minister, agreed to meet me in an airport in Moscow where we jointly condemned the American Secretary of State and the Soviet foreign minister, standing shoulder to shoulder, condemned Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. That was an incredibly significant and signal moment. It had never happened before through the entire 40-year term of the Cold War. And I wrote in my memoirs that for me, that was the time that I knew that the Cold War was over, when we stood together and condemned the actions of a Soviet client state. That came about through the exercise of diplomacy. It wasn't easy for Shevardnadze to agree to that, and in fact, he agreed to it without ever having a check with Gorbachev. And he agreed to it over the objections of the Arabists in the Soviet foreign ministry. So it was a very important time in the diplomacy of the West versus the Soviet Union, or the United States versus the Soviet Union.
At that time, the biggest thing that had happened in Europe was the downfall of the Berlin Wall and the downfall of the Soviet Union. And that would have become war. But at that time you had James Baker and the older Bush and Gorbachev. And they managed it through diplomacy very well. So war didn't become reality. So that was very skilled, and James Baker should have a big tribute for that.
It's easy looking back at hinge moments in history to view these seismic shifts as somehow inevitable, particularly when the world moves from conflict and toward peace, away from autocracy and toward democracy. But to study those 43 months is to learn that these outcomes were anything but certain. The arc of history bent the way it did because people bent it, and no one more so than Secretary Baker.
When I can think back to all of the things we got accomplished to achieve a peaceful end of a Cold War that had lasted for 40 years, it ended without a shot being fired, and for 15 years after that, people forget this, for 15 years after that, we had good relations with Russia. Russia had good relations with us under both Yeltsin and Putin. And then I think Putin got in trouble politically, domestically, politically, and needed a whipping boy, and we're the whipping boys. So it's a sad thing. I remember in probably 2005, something like that, President George W. Bush asked me to be a presidential envoy to obtain a cancellation of Iraq's sovereign debt from all the countries that were owed the money by Iraq. And so I went to all the capitals, and one of them was Moscow. And I went and walked in the Kremlin expecting to be semi-warmly greeted by Vladimir Putin. And before I even saw Putin, his aides were rude. I mean, it wasn't just a case of not being gracious; they were rude. And then in walked Putin, and it's a different Putin than the one that I had known before, who came down here to Houston, Texas, spoke at my institute, gave a very warm speech about how important good relations between the United States and Russia were. So something changed. I don't know what it is, but it's our quarrel. You know, I think we need to make abundantly clear that our quarrel is not with the Russian people, and it should not be, and is not, and I don't think will be. But we need to make that a bit more abundantly clear, I think.
We have an ongoing war now in Ukraine. So when we as human beings go down that polarized world, solving problems with war, it's very dangerous and very bad. So a very good alternative is to work with diplomacy, because that's the peaceful way of solving problems. So diplomacy has to come up more. And in order to have good diplomacy, you need persons like James Baker, who could handle that in a very good and skilled way.
I think the administration is walking the line reasonably well. We've made some mistakes, but the war hadn't expanded. Things seem to be going in the right direction. But you know, you want to negotiate that with him. That's not for us to say. I mean, really, that's up to the Ukrainians. If that's a solution, a satisfactory solution for them, they get an end to the killing of their people and the brutalization and the war crimes that are going on, and they decide they want to do that, that's one thing. It's not up to us to say that's the negotiated solution they ought to take. We ought to support whatever course they want to follow, because they have truly been heroic, and it's wonderful to see the way the world has come together in support of supporting Ukraine. I've told people that Vladimir Putin did more to unify NATO than any NATO leader could have done. Is there a possibility of a negotiated solution? In my view, there are a number of things that you could think of, but it's going to be up and ought to be up to the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian people. They have fought extraordinarily well to protect their independence and to protect their sovereignty. And we need to continue to support them in every way that we can, with lethal weaponry and with everything else. And in the course of doing that, we need to lead. I think that the administration has done a very fine job of walking the difficult line between provoking something that would expand this war beyond the borders of Ukraine and protecting the independence and freedom of the Ukrainian people.
As I've tried to look at those who've held this job before me, the thing that struck me so much about you, Jim, is this ability to have a vision for where you want it to go, and then figuring out a way to get there. It's an extraordinary and rare combination, and one that inspires me every single day. How you got things done is something I try to learn from every day, and diplomats will continue to study for generations. Diplomacy ultimately comes down to relationships. And building the trust at the core of those relationships takes time. It takes effort. It takes empathy.
Trust is an extraordinarily important element of a successful negotiation, because if you have trust in your interlocutor, that you have a far better chance of achieving some mutually agreeable result. If he trusts you or she trusts you and you trust him or her, you have a far better chance of achieving something. So personal trust is very, very important. Now, when you trust a diplomat from a foreign country, you don't give up the principles and values that you hold dear and that your country holds dear. It just means that you establish a personal chemistry with the other person on the other side of the table that permits the two of you to achieve a result.
La diplomacia es esencial para preservar la democracia. El respeto y la tolerancia son valores que deberían prevalecer en cualquier sociedad que apueste por una convivencia en libertad.
Democracy and free markets, because they go together, is a paradigm that has proven to be the very best paradigm for governance in the world and throughout history. If you look, people want freedom. Democracy promotes freedom. Democracy is a political theory that calls for the people to be preeminent, to select the leaders they want to select. And free speech, individual rights, freedom of selection, governance by the people, these are all represented by democracy. And there are ebbs and flows in democracy. And we may be now in an ebb period where some democracies are moving toward a more xenophobic authoritarian model. But though history shows us those models don't work. What works is freedom. Freedom is achieved through the exercise of democracy, the people control, the people speak, and of course, the free market is an important part of that. These central planned economies don't work very well. You've had some experience with that yourself down there in Mexico. And what works best is when you unleash the powerful forces of the free market.
En la preservación de una democracia intervienen distintos actores. Entre estos, es fundamental contar con una prensa libre y responsable.
Well, I think this. I think that a free press is extremely important to the maintenance of a functioning, vibrant democracy. And without a free press, you can't have that. Now, we have a disturbing tendency in North America today where some of our media organizations have stopped being journalists. They've stopped objectively reporting the news. They are no longer just reporters of the news. They are players in the political debate. That is not healthy for democracy, not healthy for our democracy or for anybody's democracy. A free press is what you have to have, and there has to be, they have to have some standards. They have to be reporters of the facts, not purveyors of one view or another, not players in the political debate.
¿Qué sucede con el debate político? ¿Con la retórica de los políticos? ¿Un lenguaje degradado podría ser nocivo para la democracia?
You go back and you look at what was going on in the elections in the 1800s, tough language. The language was really coarse. It was vulgar. It was tough. That's a part of democracy. You wish today that we had more bipartisanship in governance. And we now have a situation where more and more we in North America are electing our leaders from the fringes of both parties. So I say often that the responsible center of American politics is diminished, but it'll be back because that's how you get things done. You get the governance is the politics, indeed, is the art of compromise. So I'm not overly concerned about the coarse and vulgar nature of our political discourse today, because I look back in history and I see that we've been there before and we managed to preserve our democracy. I hope that's the case in the future, but I really think it will be.
Democracia y diplomacia van de la mano. Libertad, respeto, empatía, confianza son ingredientes indispensables para ejercer el arte de la diplomacia. Lo mismo puede decirse del arte como creación. Al igual que la diplomacia, la creación artística, para sobrevivir, requiere de libertad, equidad, diversidad, respeto, valores democráticos por excelencia. El arte, sin duda, ha sido, en sus distintas expresiones, motivo de unión y entendimiento entre naciones.
Art is important because, like diplomacy, art is global. It don't have so much of a boundary, and it lifts the eyes of many people, and it's peaceful. I've not heard about if art has created war. Perhaps it has sometimes, but it is peaceful, and it gives you thinking about other issues than your day-to-day life, your fantasy and your creativity. That's a way of building us as human beings.
Well, I think art can be very important in diplomacy, but I'm not, I'm not an expert in art. I'm an expert in diplomacy, but art can be a very important ingredient of diplomacy.
I had the impression of Secretary Baker from having met him in person, so I wanted to have that warmth. He has a warm personality, and I wanted the sculpture to give you that. And then to emphasize his political presence.
Sincerity, monumentality, being truthful and trusting yourself. This is trust. It's confidence and trust. Also in this time, with the war in Ukraine and this unstable world that we live in, it was a moment of dignity, a moment of a sincere wish for peace, for trust, for unification, to come together and to try to overcome this difficult situation. There was an occasion that took place around this bust, and the sculpture cannot say anything, cannot speak, but it can bring something out of us. It can create a moment that is important. So even though the sculpture cannot say anything itself, it can make things happen. That is the art of diplomacy, or the diplomatic art, perhaps is a better word. I don't know.
I'm very, very honored to have, to have been taken into consideration for this, and to have now it's finished, it's there. It's a tremendous experience for me.